The morning Eliza Rourke turned 19, her father put her belongings on the porch and told her not to come back until she'd learned some shame. And by noon that same day she was standing in the dusty street of Millbrook with her baby daughter wrapped against her chest, and everything she owned stuffed into one battered suitcase and a burlap sack. Watching the only home she'd ever known grow smaller behind her as she walked toward a town that already knew her story and had already decided what kind of woman she was. It hadn't taken long for the whispers to spread once her condition became visible beneath her Sunday dress. And by the time little Grace was born on a bitter February night with only the midwife and Eliza's own gritted teeth for company, the town of Millbrook had settled comfortably into its judgment, the kind of judgment that small towns specialized in. Passed from porch to porch and pew to pew until it hardened into something that felt, to the people repeating it, almost like righteousness. Eliza had never spoken the name of Grace's father to anyone, not to her mother's tearful pleading, not to her father's furious demands, not even to the pastor who had come to the house one evening with his Bible and his disappointed eyes, hoping to extract a confession that would let the town assign proper blame and move forward with its comfortable narrative of a fallen woman and a wronged family. She kept the name locked behind her teeth because the truth of it, that the man in question was already married, a traveling cattle buyer who had made her promises in the hayloft of her father's barn and broken every one of them the moment her father write, angry telegraph reached him, would have solved nothing and shamed no one but herself further, and so she carried the silence the way she carried everything else in those months, alone, and with a stubbornness that her father called pride and she privately called survival. Her father, Thomas Rourke, was a deacon in the Millbrook Baptist Church and a man who had built his modest standing in the community through decades of careful, visible righteousness, and he could not. He told her with his voice breaking in a way that frightened her more than his anger ever could, allow his household to become the visible proof of scandal that the town clearly believed it already was. Her mother had wept and packed a small basket of food that Eliza found tucked into her sack later, a final act of love too quiet and too late to change anything. And her younger sister had watched from an upstairs window with an expression Eliza couldn't quite read, something between grief and the particular relief of a sibling who understood, even at 15, that her own reputation would be safer once her sister was gone from the house. And so Eliza walked into town that afternoon with 19 years behind her and no clear notion of what lay ahead, only the fierce, uncomplicated certainty that whatever came next, she would meet it standing up, because Grace deserved a mother who stood up. She made it as far as the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Pruitt, who took one look at the baby and the suitcase and the proud, frightened set of Eliza's jaw and said, not unkindly but not warmly either, that she couldn't take in a woman in Eliza's situation without losing half her regular boarders within the week, business being business and reputation being reputation in a town this size. The general store owner's wife crossed the street rather than pass close by her. The schoolteacher, a woman Eliza had once considered something like a friend, offered only a tight, apologetic smile before hurrying her own errands along. By the time evening came, Eliza was standing outside the Millbrook stagecoach depot with Grace beginning to fuss from hunger, and Eliza herself beginning to understand, with a cold feeling settling into her stomach, that she had perhaps miscalculated how far a person's charity extended once scandal entered the equation, and that the town she'd been born and raised in had no intention of catching her now that she'd fallen. It was in this moment, with the sun beginning its long slide toward the mountains and a cluster of townsfolk gathered nearby to watch the spectacle of the fallen Rourke girl with an interest that was equal parts pity and satisfaction, that a wagon rolled into town from the direction of the Callaway spread, and a man climbed down from the driver's seat who most of Millbrook recognized immediately, because there were few men in the county whose arrival didn't cause some small stir. Nathaniel Ashford, owner of the largest cattle operation for 50 miles in any direction, a man whose wealth was matched only by his reputation for keeping mostly to himself and his ranch, rarely seen in town except for necessary business, and never, as far as anyone could recall, seen taking any particular interest in the town's social dramas. He had come to Millbrook that day for the ordinary purpose of collecting supplies and a new set of tools from the blacksmith, and he might have gone about his business entirely unaware of the small drama playing out near the depot had it not been for the sound of a baby crying and a woman's voice, tight with barely controlled distress, trying to soothe her while a knot of onlookers watched without offering to help. Nathaniel was not, by nature, a man who involved himself in other people's affairs. He had learned young, after his own father's very public financial ruin and the subsequent scramble of neighbors who had once called themselves friends abandoning the family overnight, that most people's kindness was conditional and most people's judgment was cheap. And he'd built his adult life around a certain careful distance from town gossip and town opinion, preferring the honest company of cattle and open land to the complicated politics of Millbrook's parlors. But something about the scene in front of him, a young woman standing perfectly straight despite clearly having nowhere to go, refusing to let her spine bend even as her chin trembled, holding a baby who was hers regardless of whatever circumstances had produced her, struck something in him that his usual detachment couldn't quite override. He asked one of the men nearby, a farmer named Pete Sullivan, what exactly was happening, and Pete, happy to share the news, told him the whole sordid tale as he understood it, embellished here and there with a kind of moral commentary that made clear where Pete's own sympathies lay, which was firmly with the Rourke family's decision and firmly against the girl now standing alone with her baby and no roof for the night. Nathaniel listened without much expression, and when Pete finished, he asked only one question. Where's she meant to go then? Pete shrugged and said that wasn't really anyone's business but her own, and her family's, for whatever that was worth now. And Nathaniel found himself walking toward the depot before he'd fully decided to do so, drawn by an instinct he couldn't entirely name. Eliza saw him coming and braced herself for another round of the pitying or contemptuous looks she'd been receiving all afternoon, and so she was unprepared for the simple, direct courtesy of the man removing his hat as he approached and introducing himself as though she were any woman he might meet in the ordinary course of business, with no trace of judgment in his voice or his bearing. "Miss Rourke," he said, "I understand you find yourself in need of lodging tonight." She admitted, with the particular bluntness of a woman who had run out of the energy required for false pride, that yes, she did, and that she was beginning to think there might not be lodging available to her in this town at any price. "There's a room at my ranch house," Nathaniel said, and then, seeing the immediate wariness that crossed her face, because she had, after all, learned recently and painfully what it cost a woman to trust a man's intentions, he added quickly, "My housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, keeps proper quarters for guests, separate from the main house. You'd have your privacy, and your daughter would have a warm room and a full belly tonight. And tomorrow, if you like, I can arrange transport wherever you need to go. I'm not offering anything but a roof and a meal, ma'am. You have my word on that." There was something in the plain, unadorned way he said it. No flowery reassurance, no attempt to charm her into trust, just a simple statement offered with the same steady practicality he might use to discuss the price of cattle, that made Eliza believe him more than she'd believed anyone's promises in months. She looked at Grace, whose cries had turned from fussy to genuinely distressed, and she looked at the gathered townsfolk who had made their feelings about her situation abundantly clear over the course of the afternoon, and she made the calculation that any mother in her position would make, weighing the theoretical risk of a stranger's kindness against the certain risk of a cold night with a hungry infant, and she said yes. The ranch house, when they arrived, was larger and finer than anything Eliza had seen outside of magazine illustrations. But what struck her more than its grandeur was the quiet efficiency with which Mrs. Delgado, a broad, capable woman with kind eyes and no apparent interest in Eliza's personal history, took charge of getting Grace fed and settled and Eliza herself installed in a comfortable guest room with a fire already crackling in the hearth. Nathaniel did not linger or attempt conversation beyond what basic hospitality required, retreating instead to his study after ensuring his guests were properly cared for, and Eliza found herself, for the first time in what felt like months, sleeping without the particular exhausted vigilance of a woman who didn't know where her next meal or her next night's shelter was coming from. What was meant to be a single night's lodging stretched, through circumstances both practical and gradually less practical, into a week, and then into a month, as Nathaniel found reasons, first legitimate, then increasingly transparent even to himself, why it made sense for Eliza and Grace to remain at the ranch a little longer. She was good with figures, it turned out, better than his own bookkeeper, and when she offered to help organize his increasingly chaotic ledgers in exchange for her keep, he accepted with an alacrity that surprised them both. She was good too, with the ranch hands' wives and children who occasionally needed tending, competent and unflinching in a way that spoke of a woman who had learned resilience the hard way and had come out the other side of it capable rather than broken. Nathaniel found himself, over the weeks, seeking her company in the evenings after supper, drawn into conversations about cattle prices and county politics, and, eventually, about smaller and more personal things. Her love of reading, her secret ambition once to become a schoolteacher before circumstances had rerouted her life entirely. Her fierce and uncomplicated love for her daughter that colored everything she said and did. The town of Millbrook, predictably, did not remain silent about the arrangement for long, and it wasn't many weeks before word had spread through every parlor and pew that the wealthy Nathaniel Ashford had taken in the fallen Rourke girl and her bastard child, and the speculation about his motives ranged from the charitable to the deeply uncharitable, with most of the town settling somewhere in between, assuming some manner of arrangement that reflected poorly on both parties even as it provided excellent fodder for gossip. Thomas Rourke, hearing the rumors, showed up at the ranch one October afternoon with his hat in his hands, and an expression caught somewhere between shame and residual anger, asking to speak with his daughter, and Eliza, who had spent the months since her exile developing a spine considerably sturdier than the one she'd left Millbrook with, agreed to see him but made no move to soften the conversation for his comfort. He told her the town's talk was becoming difficult for the family to bear, that her mother cried herself to sleep some nights, that perhaps enough time had passed that she might consider coming home, quietly, without fuss, and let the whole matter be gradually forgotten. Eliza listened to the entire speech without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked him plainly whether he had come to apologize or simply to manage the family's reputation, and when he could not quite answer that question honestly, she told him, with more calm than she'd expected to feel, that she and Grace had found a home where they were valued rather than merely tolerated, and that she would not be returning to a house that had put her on the street the moment her presence became inconvenient to its standing in town. It was not spoken in anger, though there was old hurt beneath it that would likely never entirely heal, but it was spoken with the finality of a woman who had built something new for herself and had no intention of dismantling it to satisfy a family's belated guilt. Nathaniel, who had not been present for this conversation but heard the substance of it from Mrs. Delgado afterward, found his admiration for Eliza deepening into something he could no longer pretend was merely paternal concern or simple hospitality, and one evening in late November, as the first real snow of the season began dusting the ranch yard outside the parlor window, he found himself telling her, with considerably more nervousness than he generally allowed himself to display about anything, that he had come to care for her deeply, and for Grace as well, and that he wanted very much for this arrangement between them to become something permanent and properly named, if she would have him. Not out of pity, he was careful to clarify, and not to rescue her from scandal, but because he had not felt this steady, quiet contentment in another person's company since long before his own father's ruin had taught him to keep the world at arm's length, and he did not wish to keep her at arm's length any longer. Eliza, who had spent the better part of a year learning that love could arrive dressed in betrayal and that family could turn out to be conditional, found herself weeping, not from the old grief this time, but from the startling, overwhelming relief of being offered something real, something that asked nothing false of her and demanded no performance of shame, and she said yes, with Grace asleep in the next room and snow beginning to gather on the windowsill, and the wedding that followed in the spring was a small, quiet affair attended by ranch hands and a handful of townsfolk who had never joined in the gossip and were glad to see the young woman's fortune turned, though notably absent were most of the families who had once found her situation so scandalously fascinating. Thomas Rourke came to the wedding, standing at the back of the small church with his hat in his hands, and Eliza, in a gesture that cost her something but felt, in the end, like the right thing to offer, invited him to walk her down the short aisle, not as a full reconciliation but as a small bridge extended toward a future where old wounds might, eventually, scar over rather than continue bleeding. Grace, not yet a year old, slept through the entire ceremony in her grandmother's arms, utterly unaware of the complicated journey that had brought her mother from a dusty street with a suitcase and a burlap sack to this altar, with a man who had chosen her not despite her circumstances but with full and clear-eyed knowledge of them, and had found in her exactly the kind of strength and steadiness he hadn't known he was looking for. Years later, when Grace was old enough to ask about the early parts of her mother's story, pieced together from things overheard and questions carefully asked, Eliza would tell her, honestly and without bitterness, that the world sometimes decided a person's worth before it knew anything true about them. And that the measure of a life wasn't in avoiding that judgment, but in surviving it with your dignity intact, and your heart still open enough to recognize real kindness when it finally arrived. Nathaniel, listening from the porch as his wife told their daughter this story for perhaps the dozenth time, would think, as he often did, of that dusty afternoon outside the depot and how close he had come to simply walking past, and would feel, every time, an enormous gratitude that some instinct in him had refused to let that particular woman go unnoticed and unaided on a day when the rest of the town had decided she deserved exactly that. And Eliza, watching her husband and her daughter together in the golden evening light of the ranch that had become, against every expectation she'd carried out of Millbrook that terrible day, entirely and completely her home, understood that the family she'd lost had, in the end, been replaced by something sturdier and truer, built not on blood or obligation but on the deliberate, repeated choice of people who had decided, day after day, to stay.